Hey everybody, welcome back to a step-by-step with Jake, and in this week's episode I'll be walking you through the painting and weathering process of a Finnish Sturmi. This is video number 2 of my current COVID isolation. I'm keeping away from friends and family, but I've got time to sit and work on these videos, so let's get going. So first things first, let's identify the model. This is a 3D printed Stug that I got off Thingiverse. The model was originally done by Tiger Ace 1945 and then modified by my friend Matt Devenish. Keep in mind, I will be doing some models that cover a Kickstarter that Matt is running, and I'm very excited for it. Anyways, first things first, I always begin at the primer, and now I start working in the base color. I started off with an olive drab color that's very dark compared to what the overall primary color will be. And you can see here I'm using a little bit of a test area on the model to test out the highlights. It's a trick I learned the hard way because I'm always so gun-ho about going to the top of the model. But now I'm like, well, let's go for a place you're not going to see it. So very slowly I start mixing in 4BO by Real Color and start to create a very mottled look with the highlights. Why mottled? Well, if you ever look at a AFV in real life, you'll see the paint is not very consistent. Now you can create this effect by doing what I'm doing here, like little squiggles, and slowly building up the color, but don't keep it very uniform. Or you can use a chipping technique, which I'll show later on in a different video. This is a trick right here that a lot of, airplane and also different flight model enthusiasts use, and they use a lot of very thin paints to create a nice mottled look on their models. So I'm going to start trying this out more in my workflow. I like the way it looks. It creates a lot of variance in texture without actually having to do too much more to the model, so I just add paint. The key to this method though is to keep the paint very thin. And again, you can see here that I'm trying out the side of the model, and I'm using the side of the model to really dial in the amount of pressure I need to put on the model and also the pullback of the needle itself. So as you can see, the holder doesn't want to stand still for whatever reason. I now add in a little bit of my dark yellow to my mix and slowly working that highlight using the very little tiny squiggle technique I've got going on to create the mottled effect, and slowly but surely adding layer after layer of very thin paint to create the nice little differences in the values I have going on with my different panels here. It's a lot of fun actually. I enjoy doing it, and it's something that allows me to keep the contrast without having to really go back in later on with different washes and oils to bring the stuff back out to life. Once the base colors are out of the way, I start getting the different colors out for the Finnish Camouflage Colors. For this, I use the kind of a bluish gray that the Finns used. It's a very, very specific color. The best way I can describe it would be like an ice blue, but it's very light, and it does blend in a bit with the way that the light hits snow in Finland. It's a very unique color. I like it. I'm biased because I'm part Finnish myself, but it's also a color you got to keep in mind when you're adding it to the model to build up very slowly. You'll see I keep the airbrush very close to the model, do my outlines, and then slowly work the color in. You don't want to go too overboard, but once that's done, I get the 1A brown from Real Color as well, and get that as a way to kind of trace in my outline for my camouflage pattern. Now keep in mind, for this build, I'm not using hairspray, so if I do mess up, there's not really that much room for error. I can't really go back in and clean it up as I would with the hairspray method, the chipping fluid method, like I could in the previous video. So I just take my time, slowly build the color back up, and keep on using my squiggles. Once the camouflage is in place, I then clear coat the model with a satin varnish, and I prepare for the next stage of weathering. For my weathering process, I always start with putting in my contrast elements, like using oils out on the different panels and different features of the vehicle. Lately I've been using oil paint. Why? Because it has a heavy pigment count. I mix it a little bit with the oil enhancer, the oil specialist product there by VMS, and I use the satin surface of the model to create some nice capillary action to outline all of my details on my model. I noted in the previous area back there and one of my little call-out slides that I have the linseed oil draining from the oil paint. I typically will leave my oil paints on cardboard between 12 to 24 hours. This drains the linseed oil out and allows the oil paints to dry more matte. So even though I do have a satin surface I'm working on, the entire surface will become more of a matte cup finish as I begin to work, especially now as you see I start cleaning up the oil paint that might have kind of come out of the different recesses of the model and then start cleaning up. That will create a nice matte finish of the model, but still having a little bit of the sheen of the satin here and there. It gives the model some good variance between being either ultra matte or also very, kind of satiny. Again, I also note here that 12 to 24 hours as I move on to my other oil paints. So I'll put these on there, let them sit a bit, and then use them later on with the oil expert to begin doing my oil dot rendering here. The purpose of adding these dots is to more or less break up the different elements that we have here with the different colors, but also to unify them in a way. So we're going to break up, like say, the higher areas by using lighter colors, but we also will make more of a uniform tone between the different colors. So we're adding a luminosity, but we're also kind of adding a filter by using the different oil colors like this. So on the flat surfaces, I make a point of taking a very, very slightly moistened brush and tapping it and going around. On the slanted surfaces, like you see here, I make sure to drag the paint downwards. It creates some very subtle streaking effects, while on the flat surface, it creates more of like a mottled effect. It's really nice, especially after it all dries. You can see it makes this really, really nice layer of like the sun wear that happens on paint. Now, once all the oil paints are in place, I'll let the model sit for about a day or so, and that's when I start making my sponge chipping. So I've moved on from using a wet palette for doing chipping because I noticed that the water dilutes the paint too much. So I put it in my dish, add a little bit of the drying retarder by VMS, get the majority of the paint off the sponge here, and then slowly go around to all the outlined areas I really want to pop on the model, like the edges, and think about the areas I would see the most amount of wear. Chipping is good to show off areas that are worn by the crew, but it's also a good way to maybe add a little bit of outlining. Now, as you can see here, I take my brush and start to, refine some of the chips I made with the sponge. This allows me to make more of an outline for different features, especially right there around the gun casing, and also maybe around, where the crew's at, like the crew hatches. Once the superficial chips are in place, I go and make a darker steel color, mixing a little bit of a brown and a, off black a bit. This will be my inner chipping color to really show that the chip has gone all the way down to the bare metal. Now in this case, since it is a German vehicle, it would have been German given to the finish. It would have been a red primer color, but since we're looking at this scale, it doesn't matter too much, we're okay. The trick at this method though is to try to get the gray chipping color inside of the lighter superficial color. And don't go about hitting every single one of the lighter chips. You want to make it so there's a little bit of variety and not every chip is going to go all the way down to the metal. Now once I've got the metal color in place, it's time to add a slight tinge of a rust color over all of the exposed steel spots. I'll admit I've gone a little heavy with the amount of the rust wash I put on this, but I'll go back in with some mineral spirits later on and blend it out, so you'll see it's barely going to be noticeable, but it tones it down and more or less unifies all the chips with the surrounding paint. Once the chipping is all done, I will now go back and start blocking in all the details. Like we have the machine gun on top, I'll use a rubber black, even for the tow cables and for the road wheels in the back. I'll get the rubber on those, get the tow cables will be more of a gray steel color like you'll see here. And I got a fun trick to show what happens to exposed metal. I'll use a couple of gray colors and I'll come back in with a rust wash, a combination of a wash and a streaking effect to make that nice subtle rust color that will accumulate on metals as they're exposed to the elements, especially in the back of an AFE. Now, I'll go out of my way to tell you right now that a lot of this stuff is emphasized. It's more of an artistic choice. This is for a wargaming model, and keep in mind this thing is about 1/56th scale or 28mm scale. It's tiny. It's never going to be this bright in real life, but if I want it to pop in the table, like it will, it needs to be a little emphasized. So now you see I start painting the logs here, or the, the Finnish improvised armor, and I just take lighter shades of brown, no real, specific ones, and build them up. Then I take my sepia oil paint wash I had from earlier and start putting those over the logs too. They'll really pop the definition on them and really make them stand out. Now I start working on underneath by the running gear. I take the Sandy Desert Paste by AK Interactive, and this is going to serve as my texture base. It's way too bright, but then I go back over with Earth Pigments by VMS, and that texture will be a good spot for those pigments to really grab onto and create a sense of depth when I start adding in different colors and also the different mediums to make it look like some spots are more wet than others. So now I start taking in the fixer, let it seep in there, and what I'll do is I'll take a hairdryer afterwards, and that'll automatically set the pigments in place. If I do mess up though, if I want to make some adjustments to it, I'll take their universal weathering carrier, and that acts as an eraser and a pigment mover to either A, blend the pigments, or remove them from the model altogether. Just like in my last video, I'll take some alkyd binder by VMS, mix it with my pigments, and then start sloshing over the running gear and also the tracks. Then I'll come back with a stiffer brush and remove all the excess to give the running gear a nice, thorough look that's been in the mud, but without being too overboard. Then I'll come back in with a little bit of a graphite artist piece right there, and then go in and mark up the tracks so you can actually see the exposed metal parts of the track there. Now you can see that I added the pigment to different areas around the hull, or I could say the crew compartment and the engine deck of the Stug, and I'm slowly starting to blend in those pigments using the alkyd and then also the universal weathering carrier products. I'll take the hairdryer, go back and forth. Once I'm happy, I'll come back in just like I did with the tracks and add a little bit of graphite to the very edges of the different elements there to make it look like it's worn down to the metal, and also to add some contrast. Then the finishing touches are obviously to add a little bit of camouflage. These things were the hunters of the Finnish Army and wait for the Soviet tanks to come into view. That's all for this week's episode and the second video of my COVID quarantine. And I'm hoping I regain my sense of taste and smell after this time around, so I can come back and do another model kit with actually being able to taste my food and drink. So until next time, have a great one, and if you feel inclined, please like and hit subscribe to the channel. It really helps it out, and I will talk later.